History often remembers the British Empire as a massive global power, an empire that stretched across continents, commanded oceans, and influenced cultures worldwide. But its rise began humbly, and violently. In the early 1500s, England was not a global empire. It was a small island kingdom overshadowed by larger European powers like Portugal and Spain, who dominated the world's oceans. Portugal controlled trade on the West African coast, Gold Coast, Angola, Congo, bringing gold and enslaved people to Europe. Spain dominated the Americas. England watched from the sidelines, hungry, ambitious, and determined not to be left behind. Driven by economic desperation and political rivalry, English monarchs began authorizing private explorers, adventurers, and sometimes outright pirates to find new trade routes. Among them was John Hawkins, the man who would become one of the earliest English figures connected to Africa. By the mid-1500s, Hawkins led expeditions to the West African coast, capturing and purchasing African people, transporting them across the Atlantic, and selling them in the Caribbean. These early voyages would lay the foundation for England's growing involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, long before the empire became formal. This was the beginning of an economic structure that would eventually help fund England's rise to power: African labor stolen for profit, African bodies used to build wealth in the Americas, African suffering forming the economic core of Europe's future dominance. At the same time, England began strengthening its navy. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked a turning point. For the first time, England proved it could challenge Europe's superpowers. The empire's rise had begun. And Africa, through forced trade, violence, and resource extraction, was already part of the story. By the early 1600s, England's ambitions had outgrown its borders. The monarchy and merchants realized that if England was ever going to compete with Spain and Portugal, it needed wealth, enormous wealth. And that wealth would come from a system that would scar the African continent for centuries. In 1672, the English crown chartered the Royal African Company, giving it a monopoly over England's trade along the West African coast. This marked the beginning of a massive, organized commercial enterprise: the kidnapping, purchasing, and transporting of African people into slavery. Ships sailed from London, Bristol, and Liverpool, names that would become immensely wealthy from the trade. Their journey formed the infamous triangular trade: manufactured goods sailed to Africa. Enslaved Africans were taken to the Americas. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, and wealth flowed back to Britain. Over 3 million Africans were transported on British ships alone. Men, women, and children were crammed into the holds of ships, chained, starved, and brutalized. Many never survived the journey. Those who did were forced into plantations that would generate the economic foundation of Britain's rising empire. African societies were transformed by chaos. Kingdoms like Dahomey, Oyo, and Asante became deeply entangled in the trade, sometimes resisting, sometimes participating as a strategy for survival in a world reshaped by European guns and demand for labor. By the late 1600s, Britain's economy was booming. Plantation wealth fueled the rise of British ports, banks, insurance companies, and industrial development. The empire began to expand beyond trade into territorial control. The slave trade was not a side story, it was the engine that powered the British Empire's rise, built its wealth, and allowed it to dominate global politics. And Africa, once a land of powerful kingdoms and diverse civilizations, was being dragged into a new world order shaped by foreign ambition. By the late 1700s, the British Empire had grown wealthy from trade, plantations, and expanding colonies. But a major shift was coming, one that would change Africa forever. Industrialization in Britain was exploding. Coal-powered factories, railways, and mass production created an insatiable demand for raw materials, copper, gold, rubber, cotton, palm oil. At the same time, Britain needed new markets to sell its manufactured goods. Africa, still largely independent and controlled by powerful kingdoms, became the center of European attention. Throughout the 1800s, British explorers such as David Livingstone, Mungo Park, and Henry Morton Stanley began mapping the interior of Africa. Their reports spoke of vast rivers, mineral wealth, fertile land, and commercial potential. But these journeys were not innocent. Exploration paved the way for conquest. By the mid-1800s, Britain abolished the slave trade, but this did not end imperial ambition. In fact, it accelerated it. British officials framed colonization as a civilizing mission, claiming to bring Christianity, education, and order. But behind the speeches was a much simpler motive: resources and power. African kingdoms, however, were not passive. The Asante Empire resisted British intrusion in West Africa. The Zulu kingdom, under leaders like Shaka and Sitshwayo, defended its sovereignty in the south. The Sokoto Caliphate, Buganda Kingdom, and Ethiopian Empire maintained organized governance and economies. Yet European rivalries intensified. France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal all wanted control. The British Empire, determined not to lose influence, positioned itself strategically across the continent. This rivalry exploded into the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers divided Africa among themselves without a single African leader present. Britain secured major territories: Egypt and Sudan, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Uganda, the Gambia. What followed was a wave of treaties, some forced, some manipulated, some resisted fiercely. The British Empire had begun carving its place on African soil not just through trade or influence, but through direct political rule, military force, and economic control. For many African societies, the 1800s marked the beginning of profound cultural, political, and territorial disruption, a change whose effects would last well into the 20th century. The empire was rising. Africa was changing. And the world was entering a new age of imperialism. By the late 1800s, the British Empire had become the most powerful empire on Earth, spanning continents, commanding seas, and shaping global politics. Yet nowhere was its presence more deeply contested than in Africa. After the Berlin Conference, Britain moved rapidly to consolidate political and military control over the territories it claimed. Across the continent, conflicts erupted as African nations resisted the tightening grip of imperial rule. In West Africa, the Asante Empire pushed back against British advances through a series of wars spanning nearly a century. The Asante warriors fought fiercely, armed with courage, discipline, and deep cultural unity. But by 1900, after the famous War of the Golden Stool, British forces captured Kumasi, ending Asante independence and turning the region into the Gold Coast colony. In southern Africa, conflict was even more intense. The British clashed with the Zulu kingdom, one of the most formidable military societies in African history. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 produced legendary moments, most famously the British defeat at Isandlwana, where Zulu regiments overpowered a well-armed imperial force. But despite their tactical brilliance, the Zulu kingdom was eventually overcome by superior weaponry and internal political pressure. Meanwhile, in eastern Africa, Britain sought control of the Nile and the vital Red Sea routes. This brought them into conflict with the Sudanese Mahdiist forces, who resisted colonial domination with religious and political conviction. It would take years of fighting before Britain claimed victory and established joint control of Sudan with Egypt. Across the continent, British rule took different forms: direct rule in some regions, indirect rule in others, where traditional leaders were used to enforce colonial policies. In Nigeria, Lord Lugard perfected the system of indirect rule, using local chiefs to administer colonial authority, an approach that shaped the region's modern political landscape. Railways, telegraph lines, mining operations, and settler farms spread rapidly across territories. Colonial governments introduced taxes, land policies, and labor systems that forced Africans into new economic structures designed to benefit the empire. Resistance never stopped. From the Endeb and Shona uprisings in Zimbabwe, to the Hihi resistance in Tanzania, to rebellions in Kenya, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and beyond. African societies continued to fight for autonomy, dignity, and land. But with each passing decade, Britain entrenched itself deeper. The empire was at its peak. African sovereignty was being reshaped. And the foundations of future liberation movements were being laid silently in the hearts of colonized people. By the late 1800s, Britain's attention was no longer only on trade routes or coastal forts, it was on wealth, and nowhere did that wealth glitter brighter than in southern Africa. When diamonds were discovered in 1867 along the Orange River, the news traveled like wildfire across continents. Within a few years, thousands of men, Europeans, Africans, fortune seekers, businessmen flooded into the region. What had once been quiet farmland became the roaring center of the global diamond boom, Kimberley. But behind this glittering discovery was a darker truth. The British Empire saw the diamond fields not simply as an economic opportunity but as a strategic weapon, wealth that could fuel expansion, military power, and global dominance. Control of the mines meant control of the world's most precious commodity. Enter a young, ambitious man, Cecil John Rhodes. Obsessed with empire, driven by his belief that Britain was destined to rule the world, Rhodes built a mining empire brick by brick, claim by claim, until he controlled nearly all diamond production in southern Africa. His company De Beers became synonymous with global diamond power. But the rise of Rhodes also marked the rise of complex racial, political, and economic tensions. African laborers, recruited under harsh contracts, worked long hours in dangerous underground tunnels. They were monitored, searched, and segregated in compounds to prevent theft. Their movements were restricted. Their pay was low. Their risks were high. Above ground, Europeans, many fresh from Britain, competed for power, land, and influence, and slowly, British colonial authority expanded deeper inland. Local African kingdoms, who had their own political systems and territorial rights, suddenly found themselves surrounded by settlers backed by an empire with vast military resources. The diamond boom also intensified tensions between the Boers' Dutch-descended settlers and the British. Each side wanted control over the mines, the profits, and the land. Conflict was inevitable, and the region simmered with distrust. Meanwhile, Rhodes dreamed of something greater than diamonds. He envisioned a British-controlled Africa stretching from Cape to Cairo, linked by rail, built on extraction, and justified by imperial ideology. His political maneuvering, alliances, and aggressive expansion plans set the stage for events that would shape the entire subcontinent for generations. But the wealth extracted from African soil came at a price: displacement, exploitation, racial division, forced labor systems, new borders drawn without African consent, a rising inequality that would later explode into conflicts and liberation struggles. The British Empire grew richer. Rhodes grew more powerful. But African communities faced the consequences of an empire hungry for the world's most dazzling stones. The story of diamonds was not simply a story of wealth, it was the story of how the British Empire tightened its grip on Africa and how that grip would shape the continent's future. By the late 19th century, the British Empire was no longer expanding by accident, it was expanding by design. Across Europe, nations were competing for power, pride, and global control. Factories needed raw materials. Markets needed new buyers. Militaries needed strategic locations. And Africa, rich in resources and divided by thousands of ethnic groups, kingdoms, and territories, became the center of a global race. This race would later be known as the Scramble for Africa. The turning point came in 1884 at the Berlin Conference, where European leaders representing empires that stretched across oceans sat at a long polished table, drawing lines on maps of a continent they did not live in, did not fully understand, and never asked permission to reshape. Not a single African leader was invited. Britain, eager to secure economic corridors and maintain naval dominance, pushed for territories that would strengthen its imperial chain from north to south. Coastal cities, inland kingdoms, trade routes, and mineral-rich regions all became pieces on a vast geopolitical chessboard. In West Africa, the British targeted the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, where gold, cocoa, and palm oil fueled industrial profits. They confronted powerful states like the Asante Kingdom, leading to a series of violent conflicts that ended with the Asante capital of Kumasi falling under British control. In East Africa, Britain advanced toward Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, claiming fertile lands and strategic locations. Railways were carved through forests and mountains, often built by forced labor and indentured workers from India, forming the backbone of British administration and trade. Across southern Africa, the empire tightened its grip as mineral discoveries, gold in the Witwatersrand, diamonds in Kimberley, drew settlers, armies, and businesses. Every resource pulled Britain deeper into African affairs. But with expansion came resistance. Local leaders, warriors, and communities refused to surrender their land or identity. Fierce battles erupted, the Asante resistance, the Endeb uprisings, the Sudanese Mahdiist revolt, the defense of Ethiopian independence under Emperor Menelik II. These were not small skirmishes, they were wars of survival fought with courage, strategy, and determination. Yet Britain, backed by industrial weaponry, telegraphs, steamships, and a global navy, held a technological advantage that shaped outcomes. Borders were drawn. Territories annexed. Protectorates declared. And Africa, once governed by its own kings, councils, and complex systems, found itself divided into colonies built on European interests rather than African realities. For Britain, the scramble marked the height of imperial ambition. For Africa, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of resistance, adaptation, and eventual struggle for liberation. Empires rise, but they leave shadows, and the lines drawn in the 1880s still shape nations today politically, culturally, and emotionally. The scramble for Africa was not just a moment in history, it was a transformation that changed the destiny of millions. By the early 20th century, the British Empire had firmly established its colonies across much of Africa. Yet, even under occupation, African communities were far from passive. Resistance took many forms: armed struggle, diplomacy, cultural preservation, and grassroots organization. In West Africa, movements arose to challenge colonial taxation, forced labor, and the undermining of local authorities. Communities in Nigeria and the Gold Coast organized petitions, boycotts, and civil disobedience. Educated elites began forming political associations, sowing the seeds of future independence movements. In southern Africa, despite British control, African societies maintained identity through oral traditions, art, and music. The Zulu, Ndeb, and Xhosa peoples preserved their languages, histories, and customs, even while adapting to new economic and social pressures under colonial law. Mau Mau fighters in Kenya, although later in the 1940s and 50s, drew inspiration from earlier resistance efforts, highlighting a continuum of defiance against imperial power. Similarly, Ethiopian independence under Emperor Menelik II remained a symbol of hope, demonstrating that not all African states would succumb to European conquest. At the same time, African intellectuals began writing histories, newspapers, and essays challenging colonial narratives. Schools and churches, while often introduced by the British, became spaces for critical thinking, education, and mobilization. The resilience of African societies was not just cultural, it was strategic. Communities negotiated labor, trade, and alliances to maintain autonomy wherever possible. Through diplomacy, adaptation, and subtle forms of resistance, African leaders ensured that, even under empire, their people's voices and identities endured. By the 1940s, this groundwork would become crucial. World War II would expose the vulnerabilities of European empires, and African soldiers recruited by Britain would return home with new ideas about freedom, rights, and sovereignty. The British Empire had grown wealthy and powerful, but it had also unintentionally nurtured the seeds of its eventual challenge. By 1939, the British Empire had reached the peak of its territorial control, yet global events were about to test its strength. World War II drew soldiers, resources, and attention from every corner of the empire, including Africa. Across the continent, African soldiers were recruited and conscripted to serve in British military campaigns. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, men from Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, and elsewhere fought alongside European troops. They were trained, armed, and sent into battle for an empire that had long controlled their lands and resources. These soldiers faced not only the dangers of war but also systemic racial discrimination. Despite this, their contribution was immense, providing manpower, logistics, and local knowledge that proved essential to the British war effort. At home, African economies were also mobilized. Farms, mines, and ports produced raw materials for wartime industries. Cities like Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and Cape Town became hubs of supply, transport, and colonial administration. Yet, the war brought ideas that would reshape Africa's future. Soldiers returning from foreign campaigns encountered new political concepts: nationalism, self-determination, and civil rights. Many African officers and veterans began questioning the fairness of an empire that demanded their loyalty while denying them freedom at home. Simultaneously, African resistance movements gained momentum. In West Africa, the National Congress of British West Africa advocated for reforms and greater political representation. In East Africa, nationalist groups in Kenya and Uganda began organizing against land expropriation and colonial rule. South Africa, while a dominion, faced internal debates about racial policies and governance. World War II, ironically, strengthened both the empire and the arguments against it. Britain gained victory, but the cost: human, economic, and political, highlighted vulnerabilities in imperial control. Africa had become not only a battlefield but a crucible of ideas that would ignite independence movements in the decades to come. By the end of the war, it was clear, the British Empire had changed, and so had Africa. The relationship between colonizer and colonized would never be the same again. After World War II, the world had changed. Europe lay weakened by years of conflict, and empires that once seemed invincible were now vulnerable. Across Africa, the ideas of freedom, self-determination, and equality, seeds planted by returning soldiers, educated elites, and political thinkers, began to blossom into organized movements. In West Africa, countries like Ghana became epicenters of nationalist activity. Kwame Nkrumah, educated abroad and inspired by Pan-African ideals, led political campaigns demanding self-rule. Mass protests, boycotts, and political negotiations challenged British authority. By 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from colonial rule, a symbolic victory that inspired the continent. In East Africa, movements in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika grew in strength. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya 1952–1960 highlighted both the courage and the sacrifices involved in resisting colonial rule. Grassroots mobilization, along with international pressure, forced Britain to rethink its strategies, gradually granting concessions to nationalist leaders. Southern Africa experienced slower change. In South Africa, apartheid policies entrenched racial segregation, delaying independence and equality for the majority population. However, political organizations, trade unions, and cultural movements kept the vision of freedom alive. Throughout Africa, the British Empire was forced to negotiate, adapt, and, ultimately, withdraw. The empire that had once stretched from Cairo to Cape Town, from Lagos to Nairobi, began to fragment, leaving behind newly independent nations grappling with borders, governance, and post-colonial challenges. Africa's fight for independence was not only a struggle against foreign control, it was a fight to reclaim identity, culture, and sovereignty. The British Empire, once thought invincible, had planted the seeds of its own transformation by extracting resources, mobilizing human labor, and inadvertently educating and empowering the colonized. By the 1960s, the map of Africa had changed dramatically. Colonial flags were lowered, African leaders assumed office, and nations began the long journey of self-determination, economic development, and cultural revival. The rise of African independence marked the final chapter of Britain's territorial dominance, but the legacies of empire, both positive and negative, would shape the continent for generations. The story of the British Empire in Africa is one of contrasts, of ambition and exploitation, of wealth and suffering, of domination and resilience. From the first explorers on the West African coast, to the scramble for territories in the 19th century, to the rise of independence movements in the 20th century, Africa was both a stage for imperial power and a land of enduring resistance. The empire left behind railways, ports, and cities that would become economic hubs, but it also left arbitrary borders that divided ethnic groups and disrupted traditional governance. Its legal systems, education frameworks, and language influenced African societies deeply, creating both opportunities and challenges for future generations. Yet, Africa's story is not only about what was lost, it is about what endured. African culture, identity, and social structures persisted, adapting to changing circumstances while resisting erasure. Nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and liberation movements grew from the very people who had lived under empire, reclaiming agency and shaping new nations. The British Empire ultimately transformed Africa, and Africa, in turn, transformed the empire. The wealth extracted, the labor mobilized, and the cultures encountered left lasting impressions on Britain itself, influencing its economy, politics, and global worldview. Today, the legacies of empire are visible in both challenges and achievements, modern African nations navigating borders drawn by colonial powers. Cities built on trade and infrastructure established under imperial rule. Economies shaped by centuries of resource extraction. languages, institutions, and education systems influenced by Britain. The rise and fall of the British Empire in Africa is a story of power and resistance, exploitation and resilience, and loss and hope. It is a reminder that history is never one-sided, and that the strength of human spirit often endures even under the weight of empire. As we reflect on this history, we understand that Africa's journey continues shaped by the past, but determined by the people who inhabit its lands today.